Welcome to my March update for the Marvel Snap Series 4 and 5 card tier list. Today, we're going to run through all of the most expensive cards contained in Marvel Snap's token shops and give you my thoughts on where they exist in the metagame. Let's go ahead and dive on into the details, huh? Before we dive on into talking about power level, I'd like to make sure everybody watching understands what these cards are going to cost in the not too distant future. So Marvel Snap downgrades cards between series every single month. So at the end of this month, all of the January card releases should be moving from Series 5 down to Series 4, and the remaining 3 cards in Series 4 from the initial Series 4-5 release back at the end of November, in this case Atuma, Orca, and M'Baku, should be joining Series 3. It's also worth calling out that recent card release Kang the Conqueror is now joining Galactus and Thanos as a perpetually Series 5 card. Second Dinner has said they'll never say never, but for the foreseeable future, Kang and these other 2 cards are going to remain available only for 6,000 tokens, or if you get incredibly lucky and open them out of a reserve at random. You're going to notice that the categories for this month's tier list are a little bit more linear and straightforward than the kind of two-dimensional axes I typically like to judge things on this channel, to give people kind of a better understanding of what typically goes into cards and deck lists and metagame position. To be blunt, the current Marvel Snap metagame is the most hostile to brewing and non-tier decks that I've ever experienced throughout the game's lifetime, and it really feels like the power level gap between the 2 best decks and everything else underneath them is fairly wide. Maybe there's still something waiting to be found by someone out there to crack it open, but as of yet, myself and all of the other various Marvel Snap content I consume, it doesn't look like anybody's found that just yet. The top 2 decks in Marvel Snap right now, in my opinion, are just like I covered last week, Thanos and Shuri. And honestly, as I get more experience playing with and against Shuri and with and against Thanos, if the metagame stays without any changes from Second Dinner at this current point in time, I wouldn't be surprised if we get to a point where this is more true, where Shuri becomes just fine and Thanos kind of just exists over the format as this tier 0 deck. The Thanos deck really just does a bit of everything. It's got interaction in the form of Shang-Chi. It gets to go wide with the stones. It flips incredible amounts of power into play with Lockjaw that it can then move freely around the board with Space Stone. It gets to play Leech to wipe all the text off your opponent's cards that could be countering what you're doing. It really just has it all, in addition to Thanos being a 21 power stat stick himself in some of the games. Now, the Shuri deck's not bad. The Shuri deck puts, 30 power Red Skull into play, and it copies it, and she can protect that threat with armor and Cosmo. I think she still deserves her spot up here at the tippy top for now, but that's something I would definitely be keeping an eye on as the metagame develops further. As of my recording of this video, Kang's only been out for about 2 days, so there's definitely a lot of experimentation still to be done with this card, but my initial read on Kang is that it won't be the make or break card for any archetype, meaning that any deck that you see Kang inside of, you can replace it with something else without hurting the overall power level of the deck that is played in. However, the cube equity that Kang provides in any deck that it is played in seems incredibly valuable. Specifically, Kang can let you see what your opponent's best play is on the 6th turn of the game and let you know if you should be retreating to save yourself cubes. And when Kang undoes the turn, it also undoes any snaps that were done that turn. Meaning if you're in a position where you're a little bit behind, you can snap in that final moment of the game, potentially making your opponent retreat. And if they don't retreat, you just get to see what they were doing and then have the opportunity to mitigate your own loss yourself. So even though I don't expect Kang to be a strict power level increase in terms of the numbers a deck is putting into play, I think Kang is likely going to be an incredibly important card for efficiency when it comes to climbing up the ladder in Marvel Snap moving forward. Time will tell if that ends up being the case. The card's definitely operating on an axis that's very different than other Marvel Snap cards in a pretty complicated way, but that's my early read on the card after playing with it for a dozen or so hours in the first 2 days that it's been released. Our 4 cards in the fine category are the ones that seem to have the most success in my experience outside of the 2 busted decks in the format. Darkhawk tends to be large into Thanos decks because it gets bigger for every card in your opponent's deck, and Zabu pairs very well with Darkhawk, not only reducing the cost of Darkhawk itself, but also making supporting cards like Rock Slide cheaper. I don't know that we've necessarily found an optimal Zabu Darkhawk deck yet, but it feels like if there's something to crack open in this format, it probably revolves around these 2 cards. They're really close. Galactus occupies an interesting space in the metagame. It's pretty mediocre into the Thanos deck when the Thanos deck draws Leech. However, the Thanos deck doesn't always draw Leech, and in the games where Leech isn't present, Galactus tends to be very strong into Thanos. Galactus does struggle with Shuri a little bit because they tend to include Cosmo and Arrow these days, but it's not just 0% in that matchup either. The place where Galactus really shines and why it gets a fine category in my rating here is because it's very good into all of the off-meta decks that are just running around in Marvel Snap. While Thanos and Shuri is a cut above the rest of the format, there's a lot of people just playing Marvel Snap for fun, and a lot of their decks have a very hard time with what Galactus brings to the table because Galactus basically operates on a different axis of attack than everything else in Marvel Snap. Null gets a fine rating here next to Galactus, much for the same reason that Zabu was paired with Darkhawk, because the ideal Galactus decks play Null, because after you blow away a bunch of things on the board, your Null is going to be absolutely massive, giving you a sure win if your opponent's not retreating after your Galactus blows the board up. The cards in the bad in this meta category are all ones that I think have pretty reasonable stat lines and text boxes, and under a different set of circumstances or in an alternative timeline that perhaps Kang could take us to, would be reasonable and powerful cards, but they just end up lining up pretty poorly into the current format. Bast, for example, probably has her best deck in Mr. Negative, and Mr. Negative has a hard time against Leech out of Thanos and against Fringe Sandman decks that are popular on the ladder for whatever reason. Stature, tough into Leech, and probably a card that's just underexplored overall, but a 1 energy 7 power card seems like it's gotta be powerful under the right conditions. MODOK is yet another card that really suffers from the best deck in the format. Playing Leech, you want to discard cards in your hand for profit, and if suddenly all of the cards in your hand no longer have rules text, you're not doing anything other than discarding them for a pile of sadness. Ghost and Valkyrie have a lot of the same issues, and these are cards that honestly would love to be played together, but Ghost lets you go second, and going second in a world where Arrow is present tends to be pretty detrimental. Valkyrie is a card that wants to go second and be played out in the final moments of the game. So not only does Valkyrie have a hard time with Arrow moving her to a location you don't really want her at, but she's also pretty miserable against Leech because she's just a 5/3 if her rules text gets wiped off, because you're generally trying to save to play her on the last turn of the game. Black Panther does some really powerful linear things and combos with fun cards like Arnim Zola. However, because Shuri is one of the top decks in the format, Shang-Chi is essentially an auto-include card in almost every competitive deck list right now, which really hinders how much Black Panther is able to do when it comes to putting stats into play. Silver Surfer not only got nerfed in the last month, but past that, it just can't put up impressive enough numbers to keep up with the absolutely massive amount of stats that Shuri is putting into play. So as long as Shuri is doing what she does, Surfer feels like it's going to have a rough time keeping up. Similar to Black Panther, Sauron is a card that has been pushed out of the format based on the fact that Shang-Chi has become omnipresent. Shuri decks had to evolve to keep up with Shang-Chi's interaction by playing things like Cosmo and Armor, and since Sauron removes the ongoing text of all of the ongoing cards in your hand and deck, this includes turning off your copies of Armor and Cosmo, which are important for keeping your board alive, meaning Sauron is no longer played in optimal Shuri lists for the current metagame. All the cards in our please buff category are ones that I think, even outside of this kind of tier 0 format with Thanos and Shuri that we're currently operating in, probably struggle a little bit on average. Atuma and probably M'Baku are the two that are closest to maybe just being bad in this meta, but I think a lot of the time either of these cards end up having a handful of other things that have a similar function while being better in that slot, and both of these cards could use a little bit of love. The rest of these are ones that I just think aren't quite good enough. Dazzler and Sentry don't provide enough stats for the downsides that they come with. Orca pretty similarly gets up to 14 power if it's the only card in your lane, but 14 is smaller than, say, like the Destroyer or other things that could put big stats into play with less restrictions. And Orca's restriction is pretty mediocre against things like Arrow, which is an omnipresent threat in the format. Shadow King, I think, is one of the more head-scratching cards in Marvel Snap to me. I struggle to envision what a metagame would look like where Shadow King setting something back to its base power means that it deserves to have the exact same stat line as Shang-Chi that destroys your opponent's biggest threats. I think as long as Shadow King has the exact same energy and power as Shang-Chi, I'm going to be hard-pressed to ever recommend playing it over the card that literally just blows your opponent's stuff up. Shauna is a card that I've tried really hard to make work, and maybe she deserves to be over here with Atuma and M'Baku, but she's just so high variance. There's Ebony Maws and Hoods that can pop out of Shauna when you play her at inopportune moments that just make the board go extremely clunky. She does put a lot of stats into play on average for being 4 energy, so maybe there's a chance, but in addition to just being lower numbers overall than like what something Shuri puts out, there's also the fact that Killmonger exists around the fringes of this format as well, which makes putting a bunch of 1-drops into play a real liability under most circumstances. Finally, we have Super Skrull over here, copying all the ongoing abilities of your opponent's cards. We saw a feature location, Onslaught Citadel, where Super Skrull felt really fun and optimal to play over the alternatives, but I struggle to see a normal Marvel Snap metagame where Skrull is something I would like to be playing as opposed to something like Rogue or Enchantress, because there's a number of ongoing effects your opponents could have that you'd much rather just get rid of rather than mirror back to your side of the board. For example, if your opponent's playing a blue Marvel deck, they're probably going to have a lot more cards on the board than you are, meaning just copying it doesn't give you the same advantage that it gives to them. It's important to note that this tier list and all the other ones I make on this channel come from the perspective of someone who's been Infinite for 6+ seasons running now and constantly plays the game 30, 40, sometimes even 50 hours a week at a higher MMR bracket than most are likely at. And this isn't to just toot my own horn, but it is also to say that if you don't experience this current narrow metagame that I'm experiencing towards the top, where a majority of my matches are against Thanos and Shuri, you could be a little bit more forgiving in the types of cards that you're interested in playing with, which is to say, if you're experiencing a lot of deck variety still wherever you're at on the Marvel Snap ladder, I think all of the cards in the bad in this meta tier and up that we just talked about can be reasonable cards to pick up and play with if you think you would enjoy how they play out. I am hoping that given the state of the metagame at the top of the Marvel Snap ladder where I've been playing, this won't be the only Series 4 and 5 tier list I do this month. Hopefully we're going to get some balance passes of some sort, and I'm going to revisit this and reevaluate these cards in the light of a new format that has some fresh air to breathe. That being said, I'd love to know your thoughts on where I rank these cards in the comments down below. Make sure you're subscribed to the channel if you're not already. I post tier lists like this, game news updates, and deck highlights 7 days a week. I'd love to see you back again sometime. Thanks for watching as always, folks, and enjoy the rest of your Friday.